We are here in Berlin at DevCon conference, and here with us is Sébastien from the Epicenter Podcast.
Hello.
So first of all, thanks a lot for what you do. I've been listening to your podcast for quite a long time. I learned a lot, and we definitely, one of the sources of inspiration for our project is Epicenter. So can you tell us a little bit about the roots of the project, how it came to be?
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, my source of inspiration for Epicenter was Twit. So This Week in Tech, like the Leo Laporte, like the grandfather of podcasting. Like he's been doing this for many, many years. So when I started Epicenter, I always had that in my mind. But then it obviously evolved from there. But I learned a lot from him and the way that he does his podcasts and like all the podcasts on that network. But the story of Epicenter is a story where basically I came into the crypto space just being interested in it and started reading about Bitcoin in like late 2013. And I was in France, and Brian at around the same time was also learning about crypto and getting into the space. And we were both listening to the Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast with Adam B. Levine. At that time, Adam B. Levine wanted to start a podcast network, which is now the LTB network. And he put out a contest for people who wanted to create a podcast. And there was a Skype call where Brian and I met, and we decided to do it together. So we entered the contest, and we started Epicenter that way. And so then after, we just started doing it every week, and we've been doing it for 302 weeks. So yeah.
Was it for you when you started? Was it a part-time gig? When did that transition to your full-time job as it is now? If I'm correct.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
So in the beginning, neither of us had full-time jobs. We were both either coming out of a job or thinking about what we wanted to do next. It was almost 6 years ago, so it's quite a while back. And then so we did the podcast for a while, and we started sort of structuring the show and getting the show to like a production quality that we thought was good, and getting good guests and this sort of thing. We also brought Miha Roy on as a host quite early on, and then we all went to work for different companies. Like Brian went to work for Monex, and then later on worked for Cosmos. I founded a blockchain startup, or co-founded a blockchain startup in Paris with a bunch of other people, and so we were both doing that for a while. So Epicenter, we kept doing podcast episodes, but Epicenter as sort of an organization and a company, I don't want to say it was falling apart, but on the surface, things were going well. We were doing podcasts and everything, but we weren't really taking care of the company very much. So when I left my company about a year ago, the only thing that I wanted to do was really like take care of this baby, right, Epicenter, and really focus on building the business and continuing to like put out great content and putting out more types of content. And so that it's been now for about a year like my full-time job now.
I'm enough of the original gangster to remember that initially your podcast was called Epicenter Bitcoin.
Yes.
So can you tell a little bit how did you transition about being about Bitcoin to being about blockchain space in general, and how do you compare to other podcasts? So I listen to quite a few podcasts in this space, and there is a little bit kind of a fashionable trend, so to say, to move from blockchain in general to Bitcoin specifically. For example, What Bitcoin Did podcast is very Bitcoin centric, and some others. So why did you decide not to focus on Bitcoin but provide a broader view?
Well, I mean, Epicenter Bitcoin, before Epicenter, so those who've been here long enough, before the podcast, Brian had a newsletter called Epicenter Bitcoin. So that's where the name came from. And he was running the newsletter for a while, and then when we started the podcast together, we thought, okay, let's just sort of piggyback on this existing brand that he had. Even early on in the life of Epicenter, we started talking about Ethereum, a few weeks or maybe like a few months after the podcast started in early 2014. We were already talking about things like Counterparty back in those days and projects that weren't necessarily Bitcoin specific. And so it felt natural at some point, because the podcast was about so much more than Bitcoin, to drop that from the name. People identify with Bitcoin back then. Back then it wasn't the blockchain space, it was the Bitcoin space. Like Ethereum was part of the Bitcoin space, if you remember. And so it just felt natural to drop the name Bitcoin from the podcast. We did get some criticism from that in the beginning, but I think we've always been about covering a broad range of topics in the space, and Mostly because I think we're interested in a lot of topics in the space. We're interested in technology at a high level. We're interested in where it's going at a high level, the social, economical, political, legal impacts of this technology. So, it's about so much more than just one protocol, right?
And speaking of the very wide range of topics, can you tell us about how you choose topics and guests? Because I'm personally being on this conference and generally in Berlin Blockchain Week, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of people, projects, ideas, and it's really hard to choose what we should be talking about. So how do you choose?
Well, that's a good question. It's definitely evolved over time, but I think our process is it kind of goes like this. It's not written in stone anywhere, but it's generally something that we come to consensus around. So there are 5 hosts on Epicenter. There's Brian, Meher, Sunny, and Federica, and myself. And we have a call once every 2 weeks, and we make suggestions about things that we like to have on the podcast, things that we think are interesting. And then we have some criteria that we try to see if this topic fits, right? Is like, for example, do we think this might be a scam? Well, if it's a scam, then we're not going to cover it, right? Like, if it's a clear pyramid scheme, we'll never do a podcast about that, I don't think. Then there's some other things, right, that we try to evaluate. And once the idea or the topic gets through these criteria, then we kind of vote on it. Generally, we say, okay, 3 of us have to want to do this episode. And if 3 people vote on it, basically, then we'll do an episode about it. But if we don't get to that quorum, it'll probably go in the waiting list for some time.
Do potential guests write to you, wanted to be on a podcast, and how do you reply to these requests?
All the time. We get emails every day, and generally I just tell people, this is our process, right? So, thanks for letting us know about your idea. There's lots of things which go into making Epicenter, and there's a lot of things that we want to cover. We have a backlog of topics that we want to talk about that is months long. If we think a project is interesting, it could be interesting to do an episode about it, but maybe it's not the right time. Generally, we think it's better to wait until a project has launched, or is close to launching, or there's something more concrete there, because we think that it would make for a better episode for us, but also for the project, right? If we're doing an episode about something that's just sort of an idea, or there's nothing really written about it, or there's no white paper yet, or not enough sort of concrete, right? Then it's probably not going to make a great episode, and it probably won't. The project probably won't look good as well. So typically, we try to wait a little bit longer. So these are all things that go into that decision-making process.
Can you describe the things that are interested to, at least to us as podcast producers? Also, how does your process look like on the backstage? So how do you organize the recording, and how do you process the material to arrive at the final files that you upload to the feed? So
there's all kinds of planning that goes around that. So once we've decided which episodes we want to do, we obviously have to contact the person, schedule a time slot for recording with both hosts that are going to be on the episode, because usually there's 2 hosts, and then we record it. It changes, right? So sometimes we improve the process with better tools. Right now it's changing a little bit because our listeners will probably know that we stopped doing video recently, so that's kind of changed the way that we produce the episodes. And then the files, the raw recordings get prepared by an audio engineer, our audio engineer Vedran. We insert the intro, the ads. He does some mastering, make sure it sounds good, and then it goes out on the feed on Tuesday. And
can you comment a little bit on the decision that you have recently made? That you mentioned that you are canceling the video recordings. So can you tell us what went into this decision? How did you make it?
Yeah. So video is something that we started doing 250 episodes ago, so in 2014. It was an experiment at the time, and then it became an integral part of the show. So we put a lot of time and effort into building that part of the podcast as a product. I always thought that Epicenter was kind of video first and audio second. That's what I would have wanted it to become. But the reality is that most people listen on audio only. I liked doing video. I thought it was a nice differentiator for the podcast. Yeah, from a product perspective, it was really beneficial. I think it helped us get new listeners as well. But when I took a step back and looked at the metrics, I realized that very few people were actually watching the episodes. And our format doesn't really tend well for video. If you have a 15, 20-minute format, then I think it makes more sense to do video there, and people will engage with it in much more important ways, right? But for an hour 15-minute long format, it's harder to get people to stay and listen for that long. When we looked at that and we looked at all the time and effort and resources that it takes to produce that video, we thought it was best just to lay the video to rest and really focus on doing audio. So I was actually going into this decision, I thought people are going to be upset and people are not going to be happy, but I've met a lot of people here that have told me that it was a great move, and like it's great that you're focusing on audio, because I think it'll make the podcast better. I really do think it'll make the podcast better.
Yeah, personally, as a fan of Epicenter, I can confirm that I hardly ever listened to a single episode in video, like from the beginning to end. I may click on some pieces of this video later, but it's also very rare, and I only consume the audio on my smartphone.
Yeah, I think that's the case for most people. I mean, the numbers show it, right?
And speaking of numbers, I'm not sure how confidential this information is, but if you can share some statistics about the podcast, how many people listen to Epicenter and how this number changes over time?
Yeah, I mean, we had, I think, like a lot of podcasts in the space and sort of media in general, pretty significant growth from 2015, 2016, 2017 and onwards. That's flattened a little bit, and I think a lot of media in the space have seen like a similar decline in growth. We're still growing, just not at a rate that we used to. On a per episode basis, after about 3 months, our episodes get anywhere between. It varies on a lot of things, right? But it could be anywhere between 20 to 30,000 downloads. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but that's about the range that we're looking at. Yeah. So yeah, we're pretty happy with that. Last year we had 2 million downloads across all platforms, so we're like super excited about that.
Can you share some details about the podcast as a business? So as I understand correctly, this is a company which earns money, and is it self-sustainable? Can you share some information about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, podcasting is a business. Our business is based on, so far has been based on selling ads. So that's how we make money. What I think has been great for Epicenter is just our reputation in the space, and that has made it so that sponsors trust us. But I think what's important for any podcast or anywhere where you're selling visibility to a sponsor is to know your audience. And so anybody who's starting a podcast, I would say it's a good idea to really focus on the content, but also knowing who your audience is, because when you're selling sponsorship space to advertisers, they want to know who your audience are and like to make sure there's a good fit there. In terms of the types of sponsors we choose to work with, we've always been very careful about the sponsors we work with, because this crypto space is based on trust, right? And as an independent podcaster, I can't stress this enough that your sponsorships are endorsements to some extent, and we've always seen it that way. We've always considered sponsorships to be some sort of an endorsement, and until now at least, most if not all the sponsors that we've had were companies that we either use their products or we're generally excited about their products, and we could recommend their products to other people, or we think that they're doing great things for the space. And that's why during the ICO boom, we just didn't take everyone's money, because people were literally ready to throw money at us to advertise their token sales or whatever, and we didn't do any of that. I'm sad that I'm not rich from that, but I'm happy that we kept our our integrity during that time. Yeah, I think people generally are happy about that too. Yeah.
So what comes next for Epicenter? What are your future plans? Maybe some guests or project that you plan to discuss in the upcoming episodes?
Well, the episode schedule changes all the time, so I can't tell you who's going to be on in 2 weeks. We've got a bunch of stuff planned and a bunch of stuff recorded. It's just a matter of prioritizing what comes up first and everything. In terms of the content generally, the rule is try to cover the ecosystem as a whole at a high level. I think personally I would like to do more episodes about Bitcoin. We did cover it a lot in the beginning, and as the space has evolved, our focus has moved away from that. So I'd like to come back to it sometime and really dive deeper in there and like what's going on in that ecosystem. One thing that I think we'll probably start experimenting with at some point is doing special series on a specific topic. So, taking a topic and dissecting it in a 4 or 5 episode series, right? Like getting the experts on that topic and really diving deep into that one topic and releasing that as sort of a separate thing from the podcast, but like a deep dive.
What are some of the topics that, in your opinion, are worthy enough to dedicate the whole series to them?
There's all kinds of stuff, man. I mean, so Bitcoin is one. I think like doing on Bitcoin, like the different stablecoin mechanisms. One thing we're thinking about is also, we're very EU and US, North America focused. So doing like a deep dive on what's going on in Asia, that sort of thing. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. Like our backlog of things that we want to cover is long.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Any probably last question? What would be your advice to us and to other people who are trying to launch their I would say media projects in this space, podcasts, blogs, websites? What should they pay attention to?
Covering content that you generally feel interested in is the first thing. You don't want to do content about stuff that you don't care about, so that's one. And I think being aware of like who your audience is and being in close contact with your audience, because you're creating an information product. So like from a product perspective, if you were building some DApp or some app, let's say like a web app, you'd want to make sure that the product fulfills the needs of your users. And similarly with a podcast, it's a media product, and so you want to make sure that the content that you're putting out there is fulfilling the needs of your users. And so having that information and that like knowledge about your users, I think is really important. And like the platforms allow it now. So things like Patreon, where you can really engage with like your most engaged users, is great. Like Substack and all these like newsletter platforms where people subscribe and they'll share your content. Like that's really what one should try to focus on.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot for the conversation. We will continue listening to Epicenter, and good luck.
Thank you.